Amen. Teachers, how are you doing? I feel so disconnected. Let me talk to my Ruth Hill fam for a second. I mean, every week I get to, be a part of what's happening, especially on Thursdays. I pass people in the halls, there's lunch, there's interaction, all those things, and I haven't seen you. I've seen a few of you, but I just haven't seen you. So I'm just wondering, like, how are you doing? You know, if you're like hanging out with us and you're not familiar with how incredible of a school Ruth Hill is, let me just tell you, it is the sauce, right? And so my wife, she teaches at Arnold Middle School. And I think Arnold Middle School is great, right? Don't get me wrong, because we got some Arnold Middle School. Hey, Whitney, we got some Arnold Middle School teachers as well. But I love what Ruth Hill does. I love everything about it. So I'm curious, how are y'all doing this morning? How are you processing with things? Are you surviving or thriving? Like, can we go old school and just super cliche? I don't know. Just curious. Here's one thing that I know about good teachers, right? If we talk about good teachers teach their students how to count, right? And that's a pretty important thing. Good teachers teach their students how to count. Usually that happens pretty early. I don't know if you recognized the message series art. I think maybe we can put that message series back up for a second. As you're looking at these, you might recognize a few faces. This was right around the age that we really solidified the counting process. Every one of those pictures is from our leadership team around kindergarten, 4 years old, first grade, somewhere around there. Cool. So we'll put it on social media, and you can figure out who is who a little bit later. But learning to count happened right around that age, right around that age group. I remember Hadley in particular, when she was learning to count, it would say something like this: 1, 2, 23, 6, 9, 10. And you'd be like, Dad, I counted to 10. Like, you made it to 10. I'm not sure you counted to 10. Learning to count's a big deal. And teachers are a huge part of that, right? Parents play a role, but man, teachers solidify. That's a huge, huge piece. Another thing that you hear teachers say, maybe not in terms of teaching them how to count, but just a recurring phrase that I remember, or maybe it was just my classroom. Maybe this didn't happen anywhere else, and this was just in my classroom, would be this phrase: how many times have we gone over this, right? That was a phrase I heard often in the classrooms that I was sitting in. How many times have we gone over this, right? And Robin mentioned it in our little game at the beginning, that about kids just say the craziest things, like by far the craziest thing. And I'm curious, do you remember any crazy things that you heard in your classroom? I would love for you to comment, if you're on Facebook or YouTube, comment the craziest thing you've ever heard in your classroom. Like, not a story, just like a one-liner, like this is just unbelievable. I can't believe that this kid said this. Definitely don't use the kid's name. Like, that's a no-no. But you could put just like, hey, I heard this in my classroom. Here it is. Just kind of put it there. Aaron, you're a teacher, right? I would imagine you've heard. How long have you been teaching? 16 years. I would imagine all middle school. I would imagine you've had a number of things happen in your classroom, or just like crazy things. So I mean, just that's what we're asking. Would you put some of those crazy things as a teacher you have heard in class? And you always have that one kid that you're like, they're going to say something nuts. Like just like you just never know what's going to come out of their mouth. And today, that's going to be me. For all you teachers, here it comes. I don't know if you were invited to be a part of Teacher Appreciation Sunday. If you're part of the Foundation fam, this is nothing new to you. However, if you're a teacher, I'm typically that guy sitting in. Actually, I actually like to sit in the front row, but I'm the guy that sits in the front row and says the things. It's just like, I can't. I'm just not sure that he thought that through. And here it is, because I'm about to tell you what we're talking about today on Teacher Appreciation Sunday. You ready for this? Today we're talking about circumcision. So you picked a really good week to be here for Teacher Appreciation Sunday, and I'm serious, that was not a joke. We're talking about circumcision. Let's dive in. Here we go. There's a guy named Paul. Paul's a church planter that started planting churches in Asia and eventually just grew and went everywhere, all over the place. Paul's a church planter. And he plants this church in particular in a region called Galatia. To tell you kind of where Galatia is, if you can kind of picture the Mediterranean Sea, for those of you who are world geography teachers, you're all thinking, you better know where the Mediterranean Sea is, right? So picture the Mediterranean Sea, and then there's an enormous landmass north of the Mediterranean Sea, and it's between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, right? So that landmass right there in between of it. Today, if you looked on a map right now, it would be modern day Turkey. But the little section right there in between is the northern and southern part of Galatia. Paul plants a church, we're pretty sure in the southern piece of Galatia, right there in modern day Turkey, in the central southern piece of Turkey, close to the Mediterranean Sea. He plants it there, and the reason that we kind of see these church plants happening is because they were attached to trade routes. And one of the major trade routes in Asia went through the southern part of Turkey. And so he plants a church there called Galatia. And after he plants, he leaves the church, right, to go continue to plant other churches. He leaves the church, but he does some check-ins with them, and he hears that they're having an issue. In fact, he hears that there's two problems. There's a problem that's been created, and then there are also still problem creators. Does that make sense? So there's a problem that these people have created, and there's the problem creator. So he's got two problems he needs to deal with. We're going to talk about both of them. The first one, the problem that's created is for Christians, it comes out of Judaism, right? The Jewish people, Jesus was a Jew, and so Christianity is birthed out of Judaism. And so there's a group of people, or there's this, in particular, there was a law that existed for the Jewish folks called the Mosaic Law, and it just kind of had all the rules for how they could connect to God, how they could follow God, all those things. And so it was an ancient and old law, and Jesus shows up and says, hey, I've come to fulfill that law, right? I've come to fulfill it, not to add to it, not to take away from it. He says, I've come to fulfill it, to complete that law. And so as he says that, right, there are a large number of people that can't quite accept that Jesus fulfilled that law. And so they create this problem of, what do we do with the law? If maybe Jesus didn't complete it, maybe he didn't fulfill it, maybe it still has a lot of weight in our lives, and we just don't know what to do with that. That we don't maybe trust that Jesus really could take care and fulfill and complete something that is so massive and so large, so enormous, so huge in our lives as Jewish people, right? So that was one problem. Does this law still have precedence? Does it still have weight in our lives as Christians now? That was one problem. The problem creators were people called Judaizers, right? And so these were Jews that insisted that in order to have a right relationship with God, simply being Christian wasn't good enough. That you had to go back to the Jewish law, become a really good Jew, and you could only be a Christian if you were a Jew, right? So you had to go back, start fulfilling all the law requirements of being a Jew, and then you could be a good Christian. Right, so these Judaizers were the people causing the problem. The problem they were causing was this law issue. You can kind of see what's happening. And so Paul has words for both of them. And that's what we're going to look at. And so first, let's take a look at an in-depth view of the problem that was created. So when we talk about Jesus, when we talk about the gospel, or that's a fancy church word for the good news, here's the gospel in 30 seconds, right? God and man in the beginning are together, and man, they have an incredible relationship, and then something comes in between them and splits them apart, and the Bible calls that thing that separates them sin. However, even though they were separated by sin, God and man, God said, I love you so much that I need to do something to remove the separator, the sin, from your life. And so I sent Jesus. And so Jesus came to remove the separator, to bridge the gap between God and man so that we might have relationship with him again. He dies on the cross, right, to pay the penalty for that separation. And then he resurrects from the grave so that he builds the bridge from where we are back to God. And then the Holy Spirit is a gift given to us, and it lives inside of us for those of us who follow Jesus, and it helps us move along that bridge back to God, right? That's the basics of what happened, right? There's a huge issue. Man and God were together. Issue called sin. Jesus comes to fix the separator. And then not only does he fix it, he creates a bridge over the gap. And then he says, hey, the Holy Spirit's going to help you move back and forth. That's what's happening. That's the gospel in 30, 45 seconds or 3 minutes. I'm not sure. I didn't really time myself. Here's the problem that the Judaizers are creating. They're saying that what Jesus did to overcome that separator wasn't good enough. They're saying we don't believe that the cross was sufficient. We don't believe that the death of Jesus did enough. That Jesus wasn't sufficient payment to get rid of that separator, to get rid of that sin. That's the problem. And so they say to satisfy God, to satisfy that problem, there was a law that God gave. We just simply need to go back to that law and obey it. Do every single thing that we can, do good works, right? All those things, and that's how we get connected to God. That's the problem that they created. And so Paul has a response to that problem, and we find it in the book of Galatians, chapter 5. So if you have your Bible, which is no problem if you don't, last week I encouraged you, I said, hey, if you don't have a Bible at home, you should download the Bible app. I would still encourage you to do that. And so you can read along, and don't worry about it if you don't, because we'll put the passages on the screen. And you'll want to go almost to the back of the Bible, and you'll find a book called Galatians, and we're going to go to chapter 5, and that's where we're going to kind of begin walking towards. So Paul has some words for this problem. He says, hey, I want to address the problem. He's going to get to address the problem creators in a second. But he said, I've got specific words to address this problem that's been created. And he begins with, hey, don't be a pansy when it comes to standing up for the truth about Jesus. He says, hey, that's the first thing I want you to hear is stop being a pansy when it comes to standing up for the truth that you know about Jesus. He says that in verse 1. We'll read it together. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. In other words, he's saying, hey, Jesus came, and his death on the cross is to set you free from the yoke of slavery or the law that God had created. See, God had put this law into place, not so much so that we would follow it, but so that we would recognize how difficult it is to follow. He put it in place so that we would say, you know what, man, to be in a right relationship with God requires things that are out of my capacity. I can't be perfect. And so the law wasn't something for us to live up to as much as it was something for us to recognize from, man, I really need something more than just my own personal efforts, right? That's what I'm needing. And so Jesus comes along, Paul plants a church based upon the gift of grace that Jesus gives. And it's like, hey, these people have shown up, they've moved into your village, and they begin telling you that the gospel isn't actually as good a news as I told you it was, that Jesus' death on the cross actually wasn't as sufficient as I told you it was. He's like, stop being a pansy about this. Don't let them push you around. Stand up, stand firm. Hold fast, hold on tightly to the gospel that was given to you, right? Don't be pushed around. Or, you have option 1, or option 2 is this. Option 2 is this. Forget about Jesus. He says, hey, either stand firm, hold tightly to the gospel I was given to you, or just forget about it. Those are your only 2 options. Stand firm or forget about it. In fact, we see it in Galatians chapter 5, verse 2. Paul continues. He says, mark my words. I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. So I told you we're talking about circumcision. And so Paul is using circumcision not simply as, hey, this one little thing, which circumcision was a huge part of the law, right? It was a massive part of the law. It also goes into a bunch of other things. For those of you who don't know what circumcision is, we have a video we're going to show you of a circumcision. I'm just kidding. We don't have one of those. No, we don't. But if you don't know what circumcision is, you should Google. You should probably not Google that, actually. I don't know how you need to find. Actually, you should say, hey, can someone... You should type in Google, please define circumcision, and a Word document Wikipedia might have pictures. I'm going to leave it to you for you to figure it out if you don't have, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, part of the Jewish law was you had to be circumcised, right? That was just part of it. And so, but it wasn't normal back then for everybody to be circumcised. Today, that's typically what happens. It happens in the hospital oftentimes, right? So that's a big part of it. Well, back then, that wasn't. Being circumcised was something that distinctly was Jewish for the most part. And so it was part of the covenant, to connect with God. And so when he's talking about circumcision, he's talking about the whole law. But the thing that people were focusing on in Galatia, the starting point was, if we're going to begin this journey, let's start with circumcision, right? And so I don't know how that works. You walk up to a guy, it's like, hey, man, tell me about your faith. I hear that you're involved in the church, and da-da-da. It's like, yeah. He's like, so do you follow the Jewish law? He's like, no, man, the gospel is, Jesus fulfilled that law, and so I'm not held to all of those standards. There's a grace that comes with it. He's like, no, I think there's a few things we still need to get straight. He's like, yeah, what kind of things should we get straight? He's like, let's start with circumcision. I just don't know how that conversation goes with anybody. And when you watch the videos of you can tell it's going to go bad from the beginning, of a dad pitching a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old the baseball way too close, right? And you can tell that's a metal bat he's using, and that looks like a real ball. And all of a sudden the kid hits the ball back. You know that reaction that all of your husbands or boyfriends or just any guy, that whoa, that kind of, you know what I'm saying? That's the reaction when I hear, hey, let's get circumcised. I'm taking a step back a little bit is what's happening in my mind, right? And so that's what Paul's saying. He's saying, hey, just forget about Jesus. If you want to be circumcised, just forget about Jesus, right? And then he goes past that. Not only should you just forget about Jesus if you want to follow the Jewish law, you should also recognize what you're signing up for, because you're signing up for the ball and chain club, right? That's what he's saying. And in verse 3, he says, again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law, right? So every guy who says, hey, circumcise me, I want to follow the Jewish law. It's not just that one thing. It's not like a snip, and we're done, and now we'll move on after some healing happens. He's like, no. The snip is only before we put a ball and chain of the law of God around your ankle, and you carry it around for the rest of your life without Jesus, without grace, right? That's a club I don't want to be a part of. It's a club I don't want to be a part of. It's not something I'm interested in doing. And by the way, living up to the law that God has given, it's impossible. We can't do it. We can't do it. It's not in our capacity for us to live up to the law forever, that we never break it. He said, hey, be careful what you're signing up for. Be careful what you're signing up for. He follows that with kind of an exclamation point in verse 4. He says, you who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. Man. Now let that sink in for a second. Let that sink in for a second. He said, hey, the good news that was given to you, the good news that you believe, if you let someone convince you that you have to go through this ritual and obey these old commandments that God is saying, hey, this is how we get connected, and that's what's going to earn you a right standing with God. No. So you're saying you don't need grace, that you can achieve it on your own. And that's a dangerous place to be. It's a dangerous place to be. You see, grace is receiving a gift that you don't deserve. That's what grace is. Grace is receiving a gift that you don't deserve. And so as we walk through that, we say, hey, grace is the only way you can get that right standing with God. It's not about what you do or the right things you do or how good you are or how great you follow the law. None of that gets you grace. Grace is a gift freely given because of what Jesus did on the cross. And so you can't say, hey, I'm going to have both and, that I can earn my own salvation, right? Because that in and of itself says, and I don't need grace, That's a dangerous spot to be in. And then he says probably what I think is the most important thing, something that I think resonates with our relationship with our teachers early on. He says this, for in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. He said, hey, the only thing that counts, faith expressing itself through love. And so if you've made a list of the things that you need to do to honor God and follow God and all those kind of things, he said, hey, if you want grace, the only thing that counts. In other words, Paul is trying to say, hey, I am teaching you how to count what counts, right? Now, in our own mind, we might come to a place and we're saying, hey, I know how to count. 1, 2, 6, 23, 10. Look, I counted to 10. Yeah, you counted to 10, but you didn't actually count the numbers that counted, right? There's a proper way for us to count, and that's exactly what Paul's trying to get across to them. Hey, you're trying to make a list, you're trying to count, but here's the deal. There's only one way to count these numbers. Faith, expressing itself through love. That's it. That's it. I guess the question becomes, how do we actually do that? How do we have faith that expresses itself through love? For sure, what we know from reading the passage is that it's not an idle faith. He says, hey, it's faith expressing itself. That faith is active, right? And the definition by how it expresses itself is, it says, through love. So we know for sure the way to do that isn't to stand still and do nothing. We also know, because of the context, that it's not going to be through ritualistic traditions found in the church. That's not how faith expresses itself through love. So how is it? You know, I've gotten to be around a lot of teachers. And I see faith expressing itself through love often in classrooms. Many times in classrooms after all the kids have gone. So many times in the lunchroom. So many times in pre-planning or post-planning or a teacher workday. So many times in the middle of the summer when no one's supposed to be at the building and people are putting work in for their kids. I see it at Ruth Hill when they take planning and team time and they go house to house for visit after visit after visit. I see faith expressing itself through love and the way that teachers care for kids that are not biologically their own. But over the course of a 180-day school year, they sure become that way. And what I found that even in this shortened school year, the teachers feel like they've lost something. They've lost one of the greatest opportunities day in and day out to express that faith that they have, to love on kids and to pour into their lives. If you have a teacher that did a really good job of showing faith expressing itself through love, would you tag them? Would you tag them real quick and would you just say thank you? I know it makes it very public, and I think maybe that's a good thing, that teachers receive a little public recognition. Faith expressing itself through love isn't just for teachers, though. That's something that all of us can do. And I think every day you get to wake up and ask that question, do I fall into a ritualistic relationship with God? Or do I figure out a way to say what's inside of me, the faith that understands that God is bigger than me, He's given me grace, and that there's a light at the end of the tunnel even when I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, that I have a hope for all of those things, and then the actions that pour out of that faith and hope expressed in love, man, that's where we're headed. And I think every single day you get to ask that question, how do I express my faith today in love? And I think it's different for everyone because everyone has a different context. For many people, it might be serving at Bridging the Gap and just calling and saying, hey, I'm here, you let me know what's happening. Or it might be some other nonprofit, or maybe it's simply loving your neighbor or cutting their grass or picking up groceries or filling prescriptions, whatever that might be. There are plenty of opportunities right now for you to have faith and express it through love. Paul is addressing the problem because he wants to make sure that even if the problem creators stay with them, that the problem has been addressed. But Paul is not done. Paul addresses the problem and says, hey, I want to point out, here's the deal. Let's forget about the circumcision thing. Let's forget about the law thing, because the only thing that counts, if we're going to count, let's do it right. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. However, I do want to address the problem creators. I do want to address the problem creators. The question is, why do we have problem creators? Well, if we look historically, there was mounting persecution. There was this Jewish nationalism that was growing back in Jerusalem, and it made it really difficult for Jews to associate with Gentiles. Gentiles is just anyone who's not a Jew. And so back in the first century, there was this moment right around 60 or so AD, about 30-ish years, between 20 and 30 years after Jesus was on the cross. There was this moment where this Jewish nationalism was growing, and so all of these new Gentiles that were a part of the way, they were a part of Christianity, man, they just weren't accepted. And so this pressure started growing towards Jews that had interaction with Gentiles that weren't Jewish. But they still loved each other because there was this commonality that Jesus was Jew, right? There's this commonality, and so there was pressure mounting that says, hey, we can't associate with these Gentiles anymore. It's a Jewish thing, right? It's a Jewish thing. And so when Jews would go out to try to get Christians to convert to Judaism to then be a Christian, and circumcisions became like trophies. I know that's weird. Like they didn't like have like a ring and put all of the, they didn't do that. But you feel me? Like that's what it was. It was like, hey, I went to this town in Galatia and I got 26 grown men circumcise themselves. Probably not themselves. But you see what I'm saying? And like it was this bragging thing. It was like, look, I am taking these Gentiles and I'm turning them in to law-abiding Jewish folks, right? That's what it was. That was a huge piece of it. And so these Judaizers, Paul would go on to call them false teachers. They were distorting the good news because of pride and because of pressure. This social standing pressure. And so they began to share a gospel that isn't true. They began to ask people to begin counting things that don't count. They began to say, hey, let me teach you a new way of counting. Like I know in the beginning, I know you had that teacher that said, hey, this is kind of how things get counted. But they were wrong. Let me teach you a new way to count. Why do people distort the gospel? Why do people distort the good news of Jesus? Let's talk real world for a second. Let's get out of the first century and let's come to today. Why do people distort the good news about Jesus? I think it's for some of the very same reasons, some social pressure, some pressure of, they're really not my kind of people. So if I can make it a little more difficult for them, maybe they'll grow weary and go somewhere else and try it. I know as church people, I'm a church person, right? I've got to be really careful about this. I've got to be extremely careful about it. Sometimes one of the ways we can do this is we might say, hey, you got to belong to Jesus before you can belong to our church. In other words, you've got to get your stuff together before you can really come to church. And you know how many people I've talked to that feel like they're far from God have said that? They're like, I just need to get my life together before I come back to church, Clint, or before I go to church, right? That's what they say to me. Do you think that's an idea that they came up with themselves? Like, you know what? I sat around with no prior knowledge or experience or baggage, and I just decided, you know what? Absolutely, I've got to have my ish together before I go to church. No, they didn't come up with that on their own. They came up with that because they think that's what's expected or required when they walk into a church, when they gather with church people. And it's wrong. And the folks that are helping spread this, we've got to put ourselves in check. We've got to take some evaluation ourselves and say, you know what, maybe we're doing things a little backwards. Maybe we're teaching them to count the wrong way, right? What are other ways? Could it be like the expectation we have on people and how they dress? Like, hey, we have a certain expectation of this is how you have to dress to come to church. Is that what we do? Is it clubs or cliques? I mean, let me just go over a couple of them real quick, right? Is it like, hey, you've got to be a yoga pants wearing woman in order to fit in with the folks that are at our church, right? Right? And I'm not talking about foundation, I'm talking about just in general. Is that what it is? Like, hey, if you want to be a mom, it's going to fit in here. Yoga pants and Starbucks and Target is your thing, by the way, right? And by the way, if you know your Enneagram, it's a plus plus. And now we're sitting, now we've got something in common. We can go to church and worship together, right? How about that? Or for guys, I'm telling you, let me talk about foundation for a second. We've got a lot of really good beards going on at Foundation. I mean, we got some good beards, right? And I hope that no one ever shows up and like, man, I got to have a beard to go there, because we do have a lot of really good. I mean, I love the beards that are represented at Foundation. If y'all have shaved some of your beards when we get back, I'm going to be so disappointed. Wes already had a little razor, no slip up the other day. I saw on Instagrams, So just keep your beards in place. I'm not saying, but you see what I'm saying? Like, even me right now, I'm probably making someone uncomfortable. Like, well, I don't have a beard. But that's it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you look like us or dress like us, or if I look like you or dress like you. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we count what counts, that we understand what it means to count what counts. And we don't actually try and create our own counting system, that we count what matters, that we know what matters, and that's what we count, right? That's what we chase down. Because at Foundation, what do we say? You belong here. You belong here. Before you believe, before you behave a certain way, you belong here. And that's so important. That's not a Foundation thing. Honestly, that's a Jesus thing. And we are so lucky to be able to follow him, for him to lead the way on that. And that's what we want to do. Paul has a response, though, to the problem creators. Paul calls this disruption what it really is. He actually calls them bacteria. In verse 9, he says, a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. He said, hey, this just a little piece of bacteria can infect everything else. And so be careful. Be careful with the people that are hanging out in your little crew that's redefining how to count, that's trying to convince you to count something that doesn't count, that's trying to convince you that there's a better way to count. You say, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't listen to them. In fact, Paul has some pretty strong words. You thought I was bad? Wait till you see what Paul's about to say, and you're going to think that I'm making this up, and I'm not. Wait till you see what, in fact, if there's kids in the room, they need some earmuffs, like right now, because I'm going to read it. I'm going to give you about 6 seconds or so. I'm going to stall. You need to earmuff your children. I'm just reading the Bible. Okay, that's all I'm doing, so don't get mad. I'm just reading the Bible. Are earmuffs in place? Okay, great. Here goes. Galatians 5:12. As for those agitators, I wish they would go the whole way and emasculate themselves. Right? I know you're like, no, it doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't say it. No, you go look it up. It's Galatians chapter 5, verse 12. You can get a tattoo on your forearm that says G512 if you want to. And when you get angry at people, you can be like, G512, baby. Just G12. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. But that's what Paul's saying. Paul's saying, hey, for those people among you that are agitating the gospel, that are agitating the good news, that are trying to get you to count in a different way, you know what he's saying? He's like, hey, I wish they wouldn't just stop at circumcision. I wish they'd have a little knife slip and they would just cut the whole thing off. That's what Paul's saying. In fact, in the original language, it's a little more graphic than that. And I don't mean just like a little snip. I mean bob at them things, and then I don't know how else you can, but the boys, all of them, gone, right? That's what Paul's saying. Paul said it would be better for those people just to cut it all off. That's what it is. If you're going to mess with what Jesus has done on the cross, if you're going to devalue the work of the Son of God, if you're going to try to convince people that what Jesus did doesn't matter, if you're going to try to pervert the gospel, if you're going to try to take the gospel and make it into something it's not, if you're going to try to teach people to count a way that makes no sense, that is opposite the way Jesus wants them to, if you're going to create a new counting system, if you're going to do any of that, he's saying, look, here's the deal. I got some strong words for you. Cut them off. I think those words are good for us today. There are a few things that should frustrate us any more than when someone tries to teach someone to count something that doesn't count. Jesus told us what counts. He said, my sacrifice counts for you, and it pays it in full. And from here on out, from this moment forward, what counts for you? Faith, expressing itself in love. Count what counts. Count what counts. It makes sense that Paul is so angry. I get it. I get it. I've had so many conversations with many of you who were far from God when you walked into Foundation or walked into the office or found the ice cream truck. And more times than not, it's because someone had convinced you to count what doesn't count. And I'm so thankful that you were able to connect with Jesus and recognize God wasn't as far away as you thought he was. And you began to realize what it's like to count what Jesus did. And I would be so angry if I found that someone else had convinced you to count a different way, to count in a way that doesn't honor God and isn't from God. You know, at the end of the day, I guess let me talk to all of us church people for a second and say this. Don't mess with someone's grace. Don't mess with someone's grace. Don't. But the truth is that not every church person, and I'm guilty myself, and the planet is listening. And so let me talk to you, every single person who've recognized what it means to count grace. And let me say this, don't let someone mess with your grace. In other words, do the very thing that Paul said in the very beginning where he said, stand firm. Have confidence in you knowing how to count. Stand firm and knowing what matters most. Don't sell it, give it away. Don't doubt it. Hold on to it. Because that's what counts.